Well, my background's in law and policy, and one of the things that's fascinating to me about what blockchain can do for SRI is bring transparency and accountability across industries and spaces.
Yeah, I think to me, yeah, I love what you just said, because the governance in this space is going to be key to how we truly end up using the power of things like blockchain and AI to truly bring impact to impact. But in a nutshell, the importance right now of SRI is that when it comes to investing, is there any other way, right? And so from my perspective, I have a background in AI, a background in blockchain, run a fund, and now run one of the largest networks in the decentralized space. We're deeply focused on SRI. We think investing without impact makes very little sense, not just for the obvious reasons that gets mentioned in conferences like this anyways, but because the inherent capability of the underlying technology lends itself so incredibly well to making sure that we are that we can use it to make it a better society, and the decentralization allows us to make it a society of the people, by the people, for the people, right, which we've heard before, but it's not how we've implemented before.
Well, the technology could allow, for instance, complete tracking of items on a supply chain, where you could see which hands touched an article of clothing, which hands touched computer components, where all this came from, so that you could pick up a box of cereal in a grocery store and scan it and find out where the wheat in it came from and who the farmers were who grew it, and even what chemicals it may or may not have been treated with. So it's really, really powerful with this idea that you can have this interoperability layer in a decentralized world where you can keep track of almost everything.
Well, and to extend to that, it's not just that you can keep track of it,
right,
but you can drive value to everyone who produces throughout it, right? Which is what we don't do well today.
Right.
And so going back to the farmers and going back to everyone who touches that product throughout the value chain till we use it, and allowing us to make as users those better choices. Do I want to buy this product? And we're starting to see that, right? Consumer activism is at its greatest right now, and using blockchain especially to be able to enable that consumer activism is a huge opportunity. And we're really grateful that the structures around what this means exist already because of SRI, because of impact, ESG, call it what you may, right? It's much easier for companies that are using the power of the blockchain or using the power of AI to be able to know what they're doing it for and fall into some of these structures, which is harder when you don't have the value proposition of SRI, right?
And with the openness and accountability layer of blockchain, it can encourage companies that are not participating in this type of openness and transparency to do so, because market forces would say, well, I'm not going to buy your product because unlike your competitor, I can't scan your product and see every component that went into it.
One of the, I love this quote by Carl Jung, which basically says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And we're at that stage now. It's this beautiful inflection point where the intersection of the fundamentals and principles and the conscious awakening that comes with SRI and impact, and being able to combine that with the power of these underlying foundations of blockchain means that we can go from ideas that people had to just becoming the messengers of those ideas. And there are very, very fundamental, powerful ideas in play right now. None greater than essentially saying, if you're going to use financial capital or human capital, it should only be to move humanity forward. And if it isn't, you're wasting both.
Easily understand what exactly it is, the power and the transformational power of it.
Sure. So an example that I used earlier in speaking with somebody after the conference was, imagine if we were all in a room, there were 10 of us, and we had a ledger and we were logging trades. And every time it said, Mark is trading to Amit this item. And everybody said, okay, and they marked it in their ledger. And as you were doing that, at the end of the day, you would compare, and some people might have missed something. But generally, everybody that's hearing everything that's going on is getting a note that this happens. Then you can reconcile it. Well, blockchain kind of has that functionality, but it doesn't happen daily, and it doesn't happen with 10 people. It happens all the time, and it happens with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of participants. So it's this idea that you have a decentralized system by which you can log almost any kind of transaction you can imagine. And it can be representing data or representing, or data being used to represent things in the real world. So the more people you have participating in it, the more secure in some ways it gets because it's harder to capture. Going back to my example of 10 people, if I added 11 to that, I could take over through a simple majority. But if you have 100,000, I would need to add 100,001 in order to kind of take over what goes on. But the problem is when you have the 10 people in a room, it's a lot easier to manage. The cost of doing business, so to speak, is lower. With 100,000 people, it becomes incredibly high. So one of the things we need, I think, to look out for when it comes to blockchain is the high transaction cost, the high energy cost of processing all of this data over the course of a chain.
And the good news is that's where a lot of the time, money, effort of the smartest minds is going, right? So thinking about how do we break down some of these consensus models where you don't need to tick off 110,000, ledgers to confirm that, this transaction happened, increasing transaction time, speed, reducing time, increasing the amount of transactions you can do per second. But what's really interesting is that it's the irony of the language. What the blockchain has essentially done is allowed us to create a more trustless ecosystem. And it sounds the opposite because you want more trust. But in normal ecosystems, in normal transactions, we are trusting that Amazon or Visa or whoever you might have is going to do that transaction properly. And it was done right, and they put the money into your account, and they kept a proper ledger of it. And what the blockchain has allowed us to do, and the consensus models around that, is that we have trustless systems. I don't need to trust one person to be sure that this transaction happens. And it's interesting because if you think about it, what this comes down to, and this is going to be so important as we try and bridge the gap between what's happening in the innovation cycles of blockchain and AI, and what's happening in the world of SRI, is that as we bring this gap closer, we have a responsibility to think about live governance models. Because I have this this theory, you never want to be the next evildoer. Because if you recall, when Google started out, their motto was "Do no evil." And there's not too many people in the world today who would see them as the do no evil company. And the problem is that even if you start out with the right initiative, incentives change over time. And the reason we need to make sure that we're using governance structures that can be live and active and be applied for best practices when it comes to impact, when it comes to consensus models, when it comes to government, is that never do we let our ideas, which are so good right now, end up becoming the next evil idea because it became the powerful idea and we control the incentives. So a really important part of this whole journey for everyone at this conference in this industry, and combining it with the innovation that's happening in the blockchain world and the regulations that are happening in the blockchain world, will be about trying to find governance that allows for decentralized consensus, trustless networks, while at no time becoming the new standard.
Right.
And are always evolving and adapting to what's required in that distributed ecosystem.
Well, it's something that you and I had been discussing earlier, which you brought up, was that it's very, very rarely is it revolution, it's always evolution.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we need to be cognizant of moving forward is not getting locked into this idea of only a specific type of consensus model. And so what you're starting to see that I think is very exciting in the space is people saying, well, if the current generation 1 of blockchain has a super high transaction cost and it's very kind of flat and egalitarian, well, maybe it doesn't need to be 100% decentralized. Perhaps we can create a system by which we have a smaller number of kind of worker drone type of machines that are working together in a way where we have a lot of decentralized, and so there's all sorts of different types of technical ways that you can address some of these issues. And I think what's great about what we're seeing in this space is that people aren't saying, oh, well, there's this one way to do things. Everyone thinks, okay, well, we know that there's a mousetrap, but we don't know what the perfect mousetrap is. We're all trying to figure out how to build a better one.
Right. Yeah. And it's okay that we have multiple mousetraps, right? Which is a very positive thing. The other really interesting aspect about what's happening in this space is not the direct impact, if you may, of blockchain on projects or blockchain on capital, but in terms of decentralizing and democratizing access to capital and access to projects where there's been this incredible conscious awakening. Certainly in the Western Hemisphere, it's starting to happen around the world. And current political climate has actually triggered a greater growth in that. People are way more driven by issues around the environment after the last, climate report. With current politics, people are way more driven towards women's issues, right? And so people have this ability to come out and say, we want to express our values, and we want to put our money where our values are. The problem is that it's very hard for the average person to be able to put $10, $15, $20, $100, $200 to work in traditional investment funds. And that's something that the blockchain and tokenization is changing, that the average person can invest in their values.
Talk about the environmental impact of blockchain technologies for non-traditional players. How does that relate to how we adopt and distribute this product?
Do you want to start this one?
Yeah, sure. So there's no secret that Bitcoin and the proof of work consensus model is very, very, very energy heavy. And we've seen reports of how the mining farms take up more energy than the entire energy usage of the country of Ireland, and now we're looking at different ways to try and bring that down. There's no doubt about that, and that's a huge issue. And a lot is changing there. A lot is changing in terms of consensus models and making sure that the transaction cost, not just in terms of currency value, but the cost to the environment comes down dramatically. But there's the other side to it, right? Which is, how do we apply tokenization and decentralization and democratization of participation in things that matter, like energy? We're seeing an incredible number of projects that are now allowing energy resources, clean energy resources, to go onto the blockchain, to be tokenized, so that people can create and access and trade in them. And the more you do that, the more they get capital, they get funding, and it moves forward. So actually, I am very optimistic about where this goes.
Well, you brought up earlier the notion of looking at businesses that are currently centralized that are looking to decentralize. What you're seeing too are these very exciting things happening in places like the Netherlands, where you have community microgrids trying to build resiliency. And they're trying to find ways to use blockchain technology to track energy consumption and energy generation, so that you can have people who are generating, whether it's through solar panels, whether it's through windmills, whether it's through geothermal, people who are able to generate their own energy are able to feed it back into these microgrids, which build resilience, but also use blockchain technology to make sure the accounting lines up. So
Exactly.
it's amazing to see how there's so many areas where people in the ESG/SRI space and the industries that they're interested in are beginning to latch on to this idea of decentralization and blockchain. But the other question, which maybe I shouldn't be saying or asking right now, is, well, if it turns out that the value of these cryptocurrencies and things like blockchain keep increasing, are we then going to see people who would not be interested in the environmental impact of energy generation, for instance, start to invest in cleaner energy technologies because it would drive their costs down if they're mining the cryptocurrency?
Right.
It's kind of a chicken and egg sort of bizarre good-ish paradox?
Yeah, it's a good-ish, there's no downside to both those, right? I mean, it all leads to, if more of these projects can get funding going, and get the token value keep rising because more people are getting into it. Do we truly care what their intentionality was? We want to, but maybe intentionality is not something that you get right off the bat. Maybe it's a journey. right? And I'm okay with that journey.
Yeah.
One final word from each of you.
Oh.
One parting comment.
I think that I guess the takeaway I would like people to have from this is that blockchain technology is very transformative. And whether we like it or not, it's here. And it's going to stay. I don't know if it's going to look like it does now. I mean, the internet certainly doesn't look now like it did in 1995. So whether or not blockchain looks the way that it does in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I have no idea. But the one takeaway I think people should have is that blockchain is here, and they should kind of really get an understanding of the philosophy behind it and how it sort of works, not from a very technical perspective that they could build their own, but a general idea if they want to continue to be in the space.
Much like the Web 1.0 boom and evolution, and there was a bust with it, we live in a world today that is the kind of world it is today because of what happened with the dot-com boom and bust. And we're abstracted from the underlying technology layer, right? What we've been able to do is, unfortunately, there have been downsides to it as well, which is natural. We've been able to take that and say, I want to apply it to X, I want to apply it to Y, what have you, and we've had industries and markets emerge from it. We're going to see the same thing with the blockchain. If 2 years, 3 years from now, we stop saying the term blockchain, I couldn't be happier, right? Because we'll be focused on the things it has enabled. And those things are going to be the most exciting things for us going forward.